15 years of doing ministry, I've had a lot of people come to me and have said, hey, I've got a lust issue that I need to talk about. I've got a anger issue I've got to talk about. I've got a drinking problem I've got to talk about. I've never had someone come and say, I've got a greed issue. I've got a money issue. I'm spending too much on myself. We got to talk about it. And that's the thing about this issue of money and greed, because when you compare it like to something that Jesus also talks a lot about, say adultery, that's a little, like, you kind of know, right? When you're like, if you're committing adultery, it's like, hey, you're not my wife. I mean, it's kind of like there, right? But with money and greed, it just kind of sneaks up on you, right? You're never like, man, I am one greedy jerk, right? Like, oh my gosh, like it just, all of a sudden, it becomes who you are. And so for us today, I want us to know what it looks like to be whole and to be generous and to have life. And Jesus wants us to have life. He wants us to be a generous people. He wants us to understand and put things in their proper perspective. And I want us to be a church that gets that understands that. That's a generous church, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It matters if you're generous. It matters if you're generous and not stingy. Thinking about, and I saw growing up, and both Brittany and I, our parents, we both came from families who didn't have a lot. My dad left he was in the broadcasting for a number of years, and then when I was little, he became a chaplain, a missionary, and so we were, it was just living off paycheck to paycheck. I have a lot of memories of layaway at Kmart and things like that, and hand-me-downs from my brother, but what I do remember is my parents being very generous to people, being very generous, and always and always willing. Not very much, but always willing to help someone. Always willing to give something to someone. That's probably the reason why they don't have savings right now, right? And they're going to move in with us pretty soon, right? Because, hey, Mom. And so, but it's because they were generous. And the same thing with my wife's folks. Same thing. And it was like, it's not a matter if we're rich or poor. It's a matter of what's our heart attitude. Does it own us? Are we super anxious and do we just stress out? Are we envious? Or do we understand the place that money has in our life and in our church? And so this morning, as we look at 2 Corinthians 8, Paul's going to just open up our minds, open up our eyes to what it looks like to not only be joyful and happy, but to have the life that God has called us to have as a generous people, a generous church. Let's look at this, starting in 2 Corinthians 8, verse 1. A few principles we'll see. He says, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own free will, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Let's stop there for a second. The first thing we see, first principle that we got to get is that God owns everything. God owns everything. And I love this picture we see of Paul sharing with the Corinthians about the Macedonians, that they just gave out of extreme poverty with joy. I love that picture. It's like they had extreme poverty, and they just gave with joy to help out these other people. And it's a really important thing to see, because how in the world did they do that? How in the world did they give out of extreme poverty with joy? Look at verse 5. It says they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. You know what they recognized? They recognized that they were God's. They recognized that they were sons and daughters of God. They were His. They recognized it. they rejoiced in that, and they responded in that. It freed them up. It's like, this isn't my thing. This is God's thing, and I understand why he's given it to me. And so they were freed from this identity of having things and being tied to those things. They could loosely give those things away. They could give out of extreme poverty and to help others because they understood what this life was about. And I can't even imagine the dignity and the usefulness that they must have received from that. Knowing they didn't have very much, but seeing what they did have had this huge impact on others. That's a real picture of what a steward looks like, because that's what they got. They got that they were a steward. They're a steward, as are we. And we see in all throughout Scripture this whole image of stewardship and how God owns everything. Psalm 24:1, it says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell within." Job 41:11, "Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine," says God. And we see elsewhere about God talking about that, "I own a cattle on 1,000 hills," which is just a way of saying, I own it. I own the silver, I own the gold, I own the credit cards, I own it all. It's mine. And the average person, and probably many here would say, hey, wait a second. No, like I worked my tail off for that. I worked my tail off for that. And there's that argument. That argument has been playing out on the front page of our paper for months now about who built it. Who built it? Did you build it? Did the government build it? Who built it? But who did build it? God built it. Who gave you that tail to work off? Huh? Who gave you your tail so you could work? God gave you your tail. Right? He gave it to you. Who gave you your brain? God gave it to you. Who gave you your health? God gave it to you. Who gave you your gifts, your talents, your abilities? God gave it to you. Who put you in America? God, for those of you that were born here, you're born in America. You could have been born in many other countries. In fact, 50% of the world lives on $2 a day. $2 a day. 50% of the world. And yet, you are here in the most obscenely rich country in the history of the world. Obscenely rich. In fact, did you know that if all the Bible-believing Christians in America, if we were our own country, just the Bible-believing Christians in America, we would be the 6th wealthiest country in the world. I mean, it's just sobering. Sobering.